COVID-19, climate change and the global economy top the agenda as world leaders gather virtually at this year's World Economic Forum in Davos. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu and this is The Heat. It has long been an important place for leaders to meet and exchange ideas, but this year, handshakes and personal greetings have been replaced by virtual speeches, the result of a pandemic that hovers over most every issue. CGTN's Juliet Mann has more in this report.
It's time to look at the big picture and work collectively. That's the message from day one of Business Bonanza, the Davos agenda. This year's World Economic Forum has moved online because COVID. But there's a shared determination from world leaders and financial heavyweights to help drive a robust, inclusive, green recovery from the global emergency. That starts with finding common ground on health.
It makes it extremely problematic to adequately address a public health crisis when you're in the middle of a profound degree of divisiveness in the country. When public health issues become politically charged, like wearing a mask or not becomes a political statement, you cannot imagine how destructive that is to any unified public health message.
Charitable organisations say the mega rich have already recovered from pandemic losses, but it could take the poor a decade, which is why vaccinating the world is vital.
It's important for governments and people around the world to shift the mindset to health is an asset that you invest in as opposed to a cost you minimize. And of course, you try to improve equity because typically, especially in case of infections, we're only safe when everybody is safe. And that's why at AstraZeneca, we decided to provide this vaccine to everybody around the world at no profit and as quickly as possible.
The Biden administration's latest moves to rejoin global pacts and organisations have been well received by the Davos community, but major challenges remain, and the stage will be set for upcoming G7 and G20 summits and the UN's big climate conference, COP26. Davos this year cannot be the usual networking fest it's built its reputation on. But this is the first opportunity of 2021 for business leaders to come together to talk about jobs, the green economy, and how to shape future sustainable growth. The forum expects to hold its annual meeting in person in May in Singapore. Juliet Mann, CGTN, London.
Okay, let's get right to our panel. Anit Mukherjee is a policy fellow at the Center for Global Development right here in Washington, D.C. With us from New York is Gregory Daco. He's the chief U.S. economist at Oxford Economics. Nicolas Veron is a senior fellow with the Peterson Institute for International Economics and Bruegel, a Brussels-based economic think tank. And Qinduo Xu is the host of CGTN's Dialogue Weekend and a senior fellow with the Pangoal Institution in Beijing. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Qinduo Xu, let me start with you. The World Economic Forum, of course, as I said, is a virtual event this year because of the pandemic. President Xi Jinping of China, he did address the forum via video link from Beijing, and he talked about something that he's talked about very often, and that is the whole idea of multilateralism. Let's listen to some of what he had to say.
Multilateralism is about having international affairs addressed through consultation and the future of the world decided by everyone working together. To build small circles or start a new Cold War, to reject, threaten or intimidate others, to willfully impose decoupling, supply disruption or sanctions, and to create isolation or estrangement will only push the world into division and even confrontation. We cannot tackle common challenges in a divided world, and confrontation will lead us to a dead end.
So, Qinduo Xu, listening to those sentiments there expressed by the Chinese leader, would it be fair to say that those comments were directed, aimed squarely at the new incoming US administration?
Well, it's, I would say mostly you can say in a sense to actually the Trump government, but the concern is like, whether that kind of policy will be lingering in the new U.S. administration, for example, decoupling, in particular the technology sector. Will that be continued, by as part of the policy from the Washington government over there? And then there's a concern of whether Washington and other Western countries will join hands to build a sort of like a system against China. I think obviously there's a concern of whether there will be a new Cold War. I don't think people see there's a Cold War upcoming, but the concern is like whether the world will be somehow divided between a group of countries or against a group of another countries. So I think the presidency is sending out a message that still, despite the differences, countries should work together. In particular, at the time we are facing a common enemy, for example, the virus, public health crisis. This is not the last one. There could be new one in the future. So big countries like China and the US, they indeed should work together, join hands, to prepare, including climate change, to work against the common issues facing the entire humanity there.
Gregory Daco, what do you think of what President Xi had to say there, those comments that he made, and what kind of changes do you expect to come from the Biden administration? I mean, we could see changes certainly in terms of tone and approach, but do you see changes of more substance coming?
Yeah, I think there will be changes of substance. I think, as your previous guest said, there is going to be a focus first and foremost on the COVID crisis and greater attention to essentially bringing the health of the U.S. economy back on its feet. But thereafter, I think there's going to be a change in tone and approach with more of a concentration on multilateralism. And that's going to be a big shift from the Biden administration, where there was a lot of bilateral action which was brought forward, which was not beneficial to the U.S. economy nor the rest of the world. So greater attention to multilateralism does bear fruits and does generate, in general, stronger growth momentum, stronger economic activity, and a stronger global backdrop, which is really what's needed at this juncture. That being said, I would be cautious against anticipating that there will be a big reversal of policies between the U.S. and China. In particular, a lot of the tariffs and restrictions that have been imposed over the past few years, I don't foresee those disappearing overnight. And I think the administration, the Biden administration, will be very careful in reviewing what types of trade tensions, what types of investment restrictions are in place, and being very careful in removing those in lockstep with other economies around the world.
Gregory, there is something that experts who watch this relationship very closely have been talking about, and that is, we hear President Biden and his staff, his administration, talk about more cooperation, multilateralism, but at the same time they talk about Chinese economic abuses as well. I mean, do you see something of a balancing act here by the new administration?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think we have to be conscious of the fact that there remain significant trade tensions between different powers around the world. There is an environment in which there are certain procedures, certain processes that are not widely accepted around the world, and an environment in which the U.S. administration, the incoming U.S. administration, wants to make sure that we address some of these challenges, whether they're political challenges, whether they're social challenges, whether they're climate challenges. So the Biden administration, while it will bring a more traditional perspective in terms of leadership and collaboration across different powers around the world, it will not refrain from imposing sanctions where it does see the need for such sanctions. And it will, as I mentioned earlier, maintain a trade stance that is not going to be a pure free trade trade stance, one that will still have some protectionism, but perhaps protectionism that is more geared towards supporting the U.S. economy, especially as it tries to recover from the COVID crisis.
Nicolas Veron, the Chinese president, Xi Jinping, he also said that he wants to bolster the role of the G20 in global economic governance. He pointed to, well, he used these words, the rather shaky recovery from the coronavirus pandemic. How will European leaders be viewing this?
I think there is nothing to object to from the perspective of European leaders in what Xi Jinping said in Davos today. if you will, it's a perfect globalist speech, and that's very much the rhetoric and the ideology of EU discourse as well. So I don't see a difference here. And I also know that Xi Jinping's speech is in contrast to some things we have seen from some other Chinese policymakers and diplomats in the past 12 months, the so-called Wolf warrior diplomacy. That's not at all the tone of today's speech. I think at some point Xi Jinping said something along the lines of the big and strong should not bully the smaller actors, which is the opposite, in a way, of Wolf warrior diplomacy and also of Trumpism. So this is very promising. It's a very conciliatory, constructive speech. I think it will be well received in Europe, as it should be, I think, well received in the rest of the world.
Qinduo Xu, there's an important point there raised by Nicolas Veron, and that is there has been in the past from China more tougher language, more abrasive language being used, but that was, of course, during the administration of Donald Trump. Do you see a change from China as well as the newest administration takes office here in Washington?
I do think so. If you look at the in the public sphere, for example, the Chinese spokesperson or the foreign ministry or the Chinese officials, basically they are taking a very cautious and optimistic attitudes in welcoming the Biden administration. Because I think both sides understand that there are differences between the two countries, obviously. It's really, how to resolve those differences. And they believe that, under Biden administration, they can talk to each other, though with different opinions, but at least they can talk to each other, they can engage each other. Unlike the previous administration, basically, that is a very blunt approach. And obviously it hasn't produced the desired result for Washington or for Beijing. So people are looking forward to see when and where to start the discussion or the dialogue between the two sides.
Right. Anit Mukherjee, India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi, he is expected to address the forum on Thursday, later this week. India's been very hard hit by the pandemic. In fact, it's been one of the worst performing economies during this pandemic that swept the world. What can we expect from Narendra Modi on Thursday?
Well, I think it's going to be a positive message, a hopeful message. Yes, India was affected very, very severely with the crisis, and it's still not definitely out of the doldrums. But there are hopeful signs emerging from India. The rate of infection is going down. The latest numbers of indirect tax collection, GST or VAT, is the highest ever recorded, and the economy is showing signs of recovery. It's still a long way to go. The other thing that I'm sure the Prime Minister Modi is going to highlight is India's contribution to the global vaccination effort, and India being one of the biggest producers of vaccines globally. So I think that it would be a hopeful message, it would be a positive message, but also something of a realistic message that there is a long way to go till developing countries especially come out of this really deep recession that the COVID-19 crisis has brought upon us.
Okay, we need to take a quick break right now. More of our conversation when we return. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.
The world's currencies are more connected than ever before. The mechanisms that drive the economy are universal. Money moves markets. We explain these trends and show you how the cash in your pocket can have a wide-reaching effect. Because money makes the world go round. Global business.
China 24, only on CGTN.
Welcome back. We're talking about the virtual gathering of leaders at this year's World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. Let's get back to our panel right now. And Qinduo Xu, I'm sure one of the things that many leaders around the world will be doing over the coming months is a deep soul search into what went wrong in their response to the pandemic. We've seen over the past 12 months how so many countries were so ill prepared to tackle this virus. Here in the United States, we saw it. We saw it in the United Kingdom as well. This is what Pascal Soriot, who is the CEO of AstraZeneca, the pharmaceutical company, this is what he had to say at the forum. Let's watch.
I think really what has not worked very well, in my opinion, is global collaboration and also, better preparedness. In the OECD countries, for instance, about 3% of total health expenditure is spent on prevention, only 3%. 20% of this 3%, which is 0.6% of total healthcare expenditures, is spent on immunization and early detection of disease. So essentially, we kind of tend to wait for people to become sick to kind of try to address that, as opposed to early detecting disease and preventing it.
So Qinduo, China has had success in combating the pandemic. It took some very tough measures, implemented these measures very quickly. But of course, the rest of the world is still affected, and we live in this global village right now. What do you think can be done in the future to prevent what we've just seen over the past 12 months?
Well, I think obviously, when we one day, hopefully this year, we can contain the virus for most part of the world, and then people can start traveling again, returning to normal business. And then the governments around the world can, talk to each other to really review, what has worked, what has not worked in terms of dealing with a crisis at such a huge scale. Basically, every country gets involved. So there are some Chinese, obviously, experience which proves, rather effective. Many people would say, in particular, some media would say, China introduced this draconian or harsh measures over there. But the people, on the other hand, people probably seems there's a lack of understanding. If you talk to the Chinese public, if there's no quick reaction, quick action from the government, the people somehow they would worried. They would welcome the government to act quickly and in a strict manner and in a specific manner. What kind of measures you are going to introduce and what directions we need to follow in order to prevent the spread of the virus. So basically, there is a quite, I would say, smooth cooperation between the government and the public. And of course, China is just like other countries, experiencing another a wave of infection. You see different parts of China, with the popping up cases over there. So people do have our own concern. Are we, meeting somehow a new problem, a new challenge somehow out of our expectation? What else we need to do to stop, to keep the virus under control, especially for this winter. So no country is 100% sure, what's the best way to deal with the virus. Yeah. It's really based on, on a trial basis. But, some measures work, some measures probably not that effective.
Gregory, if we looked at some of the points that President Xi hit in his address to the forum, I mean, he did address a number of issues that are at the top of the agenda insofar as relations with the United States is concerned. Let's listen to part of what he had to say.
As a long-standing supporter of economic globalization, China is committed to following through on its fundamental policy of opening up. China will continue to promote trade and investment liberalization and facilitation, help keep the global industrial and supply chains smooth and stable, and advance high-quality Belt and Road cooperation. China will fully implement the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. It will do more on the ecological front by transforming and improving its industrial structure and energy mix at a faster pace, and promoting a green, low-carbon way of life and production.
So, Gregory, in fact, we did hear from the White House today, on Monday, that they are conducting a pretty thorough, or what was called an interagency review of the relationship with China right now. But listening to what President Xi Jinping had to say there, it does meet some of the concerns that the U.S. has in this relationship, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, I think one of the interesting paradigms of the past few years is that China ended up playing the adult in the room when it came to relationships between the U.S. and China, promoting that globalist message that Nicolas was highlighting, but also talking about this desire for greater multilateralism. I think with the new Biden administration, we're going to face a new concept, a new framework, essentially, where there is going to be more attention to a lot of these topics that were highlighted in Xi Jinping's speech. These include climate change, these include trade, and an assessment that trade needs to be promoted to favor growth, not just to favor some mercantilist agenda. And that is going to be a big part of Biden's agenda. We know that he's going to push hard on the climate change front, on the recovery front to get us out of this recovery as healthy and as strong as possible, but also to look at how to ensure a trading environment that is both multilateral but also sustainable over the long run and ensures that the U.S. Maintains a strategically competitive position. And that's going to be key over the coming months and coming years.
Nicolas Veron, of course, over the past 4 years, we've had Donald Trump and his policy of America first, the inward-looking policy of his administration. Of course, the world didn't stand still at that time. We just saw recently the European Union signed or agreed to a trade deal with China. That trade deal still has to be ratified by the European Parliament. We know that the Biden administration is not happy with that deal. Just today, in that same news conference, the White House said that it would be consulting with its allies while it is formulating its China policy. But does this trade deal signify that actually Europe is going to go on its own?
I'm not sure there is a strong indication at this point that the Biden administration is unhappy with the European deal. I think a number of comments have been need to be put into perspective and don't necessarily indicate displeasure on the Biden administration side. And of course, a couple of weeks before Europe announced its deal with China, but also after the US election was won by Joe Biden, a number of other partners of the US, including Japan and Australia, signed the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, also with China, which in a way goes further than the European deal, or at least doesn't have the same safeguards, including in terms of reference to international labor standards and other similar aspects. So I think, at this point, we have heard congressional hearings for appointments in the US administration. Obviously, the Senate is on a generally hawkish stance vis-a-vis China, so it's not surprising that in the context of those congressional hearings, the sound bites of the Biden administration appointees would be a firmness towards China, which is in any case, a perfectly legitimate position. But I think in terms of the big strategic choices that the Biden administration will have to make, it's still very, very early days, including in terms of the coordination with other partners, including Japan, Australia, European Union, and others. As to the European deal on investment with China, I think the main thing that this initiative shows is that the EU is not on a trajectory of decoupling with China. Decoupling is not the EU strategy. There is no indication at this point that decoupling is the Biden administration strategy. So I don't see necessarily a difference here.
Anit Mukherjee, I want to talk about inequality. That's something that we've heard a lot about over the last few years. I mean, the world is beset, even before the pandemic, it was beset with inequality. The pandemic, of course, made that worse. The executive director of Oxfam, Gabriela Bucher, has been talking about that. Let's listen what she had to say.
Inequality has grown almost in every country in the world during this pandemic period. And it's the first time this happened since records began. So we're seeing the biggest surge in inequality during this period. And what has been so shocking is 10 men, 10 billionaires, have made $500 billion during the pandemic period. So that is enough to vaccinate. You could buy vaccines to vaccinate the whole world and also prevent anybody from falling into poverty.
So, Anit, of course, inequality is a huge challenge. In fact, Oxfam did say that more than a third of the world's population, about 2.7 billion people, haven't received any government aid during this pandemic. How do you see that change?
Well, it is the billion-trillion-dollar question. And this is a trend that has been exacerbated by COVID-19. In fact, this is also not only inequality is rising, but absolute levels of poverty are rising. The World Bank estimates about 100 million people in the developing countries would fall back into poverty. So we are seeing a regression of a lot of the gains that we have made over the last 20 years or even more. So I think there is also a realization that there is something broken in the system. You can't deal with inequality when in developing countries, at least, you don't have living wages, you don't have a system of social protection, you don't have unemployment protection against unemployment. So all those systems need to be actually either put in place or strengthened. And then you need really creation of jobs, high quality jobs. And one of the biggest driver of this inequality and over time that would also determine the levels of inequality is the fallback in human capital. Schools have been closed. Governments over the next at least 5 to 6 years will not have enough money to invest more in education, health. Right. These are very critical issues, and there are no easy answers. But it's only when the world gets together and puts its mind together and its money together that it will happen. Just a one data point that I want to share is the total amount of stimulus that's been given by mostly advanced countries is $20 trillion and a global GDP of $80 trillion. So it's a quarter of the world's GDP this year has been given as stimulus, but mostly in developed countries, not developing countries.
Qinduo Xu, speaking of inequality, the RAND Corporation, a United States think tank, they came up with a new term, a new kind of nationalism, and this is known as vaccine nationalism, which it says is taking root. That is the unequal distribution of COVID-19 vaccines. Oxfam says it could cost up to $25 billion to supply lower-income countries with this vaccine. China will play a role in that. What kind of a role would China play?
Well, China, Chinese leader Xi Jinping had promised actually before this Davos meeting earlier, 2020, he made a public commitment that China will make the vaccines developed at the Chinese side a public good available to every country, in particular to developing countries.
Right.
Most of the Chinese vaccines are based on the traditional methods. It takes a bit longer time than the Pfizer one or Moderna one. But right now, more and more countries are buying this vaccine, so hopefully it helps. Yeah.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.